Welcome to Toll 101, Introduction to Tolling, Toll Principles and Practices. This program is made possible through funding provided by Aegis Projects, Inc., and with the additional cooperation of Atkins, Valencia College in Orlando, Florida, and Patterson-Bach Communications. Hello, I'm Marty Stone, Chief Operating Officer of Aegis Projects USA, a division of Aegis Group, and I'm joined today by Tom Nucky, National Toll Technology Director from Atkins, a member of the SNC Lavalin Group. Toll 101 was designed to educate a variety of audiences to the unique characteristics and value of tolling as part of the approach to finance, build, and operate viable transportation solutions in North America.
Today, most funding for highway maintenance and expansion comes from state and federal gas taxes. These funds have run low and are expected to continue to diminish, primarily because cars have become more fuel efficient. Though some states have increased their gas taxes, the federal tax on gasoline hasn't changed since 1993. Federal taxes go into a fund dedicated to transportation called the Highway Trust Fund. Since 2008, this fund has gone into the red. It's up to Congress to figure out what to do about the federal trust fund. But states have similar trust funds with the same problems. We believe tolling is a very important part of the overall solution of the surface transportation problems facing virtually every urban area in North America.
Toll 101 is divided into 7 segments that are introductory in nature. They're not designed for experts or to make you an expert. They should be perfect for those interested in a high-level view of the toll industry, how tolling works, the different approaches to toll technology and operations, things that would give someone a good basic understanding of the toll business.
This series will be ideal for engineering and planning students or new hires for toll and transportation agencies, or for the companies that support these types of public agencies. This education would also be beneficial for elected and appointed public officials who are involved in transportation.
So you can watch this series sequentially, or you can watch each section individually, depending upon your interests. Again, thank you to Tom Nucky from Atkins for helping me present Toll 101. And I hope you find this material helpful in better understanding tolling and transportation in North America. Welcome to Section 6 of Toll 101, Toll Interoperability. Today we're going to look at how the U.S. is approaching making toll collection interoperable throughout regions and eventually throughout the entire country. IBTTA, the International Bridge, Tunnel, and Turnpike Association, developed the National Interoperability Committee, and we're going to take a look at how that committee was formed, what it did to move forward, and what some of the results were of those committee activities. Then we're going to look at the approach for overcoming some of the technical problems related to toll interoperability, and we're going to look at overcoming some of the institutional issues. And then we're going to take a brief overview of how we're already addressing toll interoperability in the U.S. Back in 2009, between 2009 and 2010, IBTTA began to form the first interoperability committee. That really was a small group of people who started to discuss interoperability as an issue that needed to be addressed. And we ended up forming a committee, original committee that you see on the screen here. That committee was made up of primarily consultants to public agencies. There were a few representatives from public agencies on the committee, but it was primarily consultants who were deeply involved in toll collection and supporting a wide variety of public agencies across the U.S. Tom is one of the original members, and
so are you, Marty.
Fortunately, I was in position to chair the committee. But it was very difficult for us back then because toll interoperability was not an issue here in the U.S. It wasn't on the radar screen of any of the agencies. It wasn't a high priority within the U.S. Congress. So it really was a challenge to get public agencies and to get people within the toll business interested, especially on the private side, interested in toll interoperability. Then along came a thing called MAP 21. MAP 21 was moving ahead for progress in the 21st century. Congress always has to come up with a unique name for every bill they write. But MAP 21 essentially was the transportation bill in 2012. And in that bill, you can see there was a sentence that said, the toll industry needs to plan and implement technologies and business practices leading to electronic toll interoperability. Really a fairly general statement, but boy, it got the attention of every public agency in the United States, every public toll agency. And all of a sudden, where we as a committee had no interest at all from any public agencies to be involved in the discussion on toll interoperability, all of a sudden we had everybody interested, and the committee grew to about 30 to 40 representatives from major public agencies all over the United States. It was an interesting process. The committee turned out to have a great value and great output. And I think the US is well on the way toward achieving that national interoperability that was the vision of the people who wrote this piece of MAP 21. Some of the challenges that we faced, well, they were both technical and institutional, right, Tom?
Right, they sure were. And when Congress gave us that mandate, it was a game changer for us in interoperability. We had been slugging along doing some of the hard work, but we hadn't really got the consensus of people on board yet. And so, backsetting a little bit, why was interoperability needed? Well, we talked in some of our previous segments about cash being an interoperable method of make a toll payment. Well, there's fewer and fewer locations that are accepting cash on toll roads. In fact, some are all electronic tolling now. And there's more and more interstates that are adding express and hot lanes and managed lanes. So more customers, more people traveling around the US are going to be potentially using toll roads. So Congress saw that we needed to get on the ball and push us along forward with MAP 21 and a mandate.
But Tom, there are four major challenges we were facing back in 2010.
Right, and those were mainly different brands, different technologies, no dedicated resources, and really the lack of financial means to get this interoperability done. So let's talk about those. Multiple brands. There's multiple brands of tolling. There's Easy Pass in the Northeast, there's SunPass, there's TexTag, there's Fast Track. There's all these different flavors of tolling around the country. There were 100 different toll agencies in the US that had different management structures and different business rules as it relates to their use of tolling. And there's really no national standard for either the technology or the business rules. So we had, when it comes to the technology, we had 7 different types of technology. And you can think of these simplistically, I like to say, as different languages. Because the transponders, those devices in your car that you use to pay your toll, they speak different languages. In most cases, they only spoke one language. But there were 7 different languages across the country being spoken. And so it was hard to understand from the technology standpoint of view. If you got one transponder in one language, it wouldn't work in another language. So if you got an Easy Pass transponder from the Northeast, it wouldn't work in Texas, as an example. And there were really no fundamental base level technology standards throughout the US for this toll technology.
Resources were also a problem. And when you look at all of these agencies, and there's well over 100, I think there's, and when you include Canada and Mexico, there's something like 130 toll agencies in North America. Not one of them had set aside any funding for any activities related to interoperability. So they had no work program, they had no planning process, they had virtually nothing in their pockets to deal with interoperability, even from an investigation standpoint, let alone from an implementation standpoint. There was no long-term funding at all for any interoperability, either within the agencies, within the federal government, or within the industry. Even the private companies hadn't been setting aside any funding, which made this a real hurdle. And then there was a lack of financial infrastructure, because what we're really talking about in the toll business are financial transactions. These are no different than retail transactions that you generate when you go into a department store or a gasoline station. And there had to be some way to exchange those transactions and then settle the funds. And there was nothing in place. There were no clearinghouses. There was no network. These were essentially 100+ independent agencies who had similar business practices, but they were really not part of any kind of a national network. And even the regional networks at that time had some of their own challenges. And there was no way to move the money. That I think might have been one of the biggest problems. While some of them knew how to exchange the message sets, the transactions, they had no infrastructure at all to settle the funds. So one of the the main focus of the Interoperability Committee, the primary goal was to end up with some type of a process that allowed our prepaid electronic toll customers to travel across all the jurisdictions in the US basically with one account, and so that they also would have a choice of payments. So one account, a choice of payments, and then we wanted to make sure that the solutions were flexible enough to accommodate any changes that were coming down the pipe. And we had a pretty good idea at that time that open road tolling and that some of the more sophisticated tolling technologies were in the works. We wanted to make sure that interoperability wouldn't preclude some of those things from happening. We also were interested in this evolutionary path.
Right, because there's a huge financial investment already made by agencies in their existing technologies. As you mentioned before, there's no funding available to change everything out, and it would be a massive customer disruption, if we had said, okay, let's change to a certain type of transponder and get rid of all the existing ones. So that investment in the existing technology was also a hindrance in our ability to get widespread initial interoperability.
So it was really important for us as a committee to understand what steps we were going to have to take to fix this problem. And part of it was that we didn't feel like the public sector should be the only ones involved. The toll industry is supported by a number of private providers, both on the engineering side and on the vendor side, who produce the various products and hardware and software that we use. We felt everyone really needed to be involved in this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the private sector, we looked for a lot of innovation and new technologies to help us gain interoperability over time.
One of my things as chair was to encourage the members of the committee to look at other industries. It was my belief that this problem had already been looked at and solved in a number of other industries, and specifically the cell phone industry, credit card, financial services industry, and banking. All of them had gone through this same kind of growth problems, where they started out as either small, independent, local organizations, then became regional, and eventually became national. And I felt that we could learn from them. And I thought the cell phone industry was one of the best in terms of the path that they went through and some of the hurdles and challenges that they overcame. Many of you may not know that when the FCC started developing the licenses for cell phones, those licenses were passed out locally. There weren't any national licenses for cell phones and cell phone towers and franchises. They were virtually all local, and certain states got so many of them. And we literally had hundreds of cell phone companies operating in the US. And back in the day when we started, they had these outrageous roaming fees. When you moved with your cell phone from your city to another city, you paid an outrageous amount.
Which you had to carry in a briefcase because it was a brick, right?
That's right. I had what was called a bag phone, And the battery alone weighed about 5 pounds. It was crazy. But what happened over time was there were a number of mergers and acquisitions down to the cell phone companies that you're pretty familiar with today. And when you see these cell phone companies, you go, okay, what's the problem? My cell phone works everywhere. But actually, your cell phone really doesn't work everywhere, because the phone industry has always had a process called interchange. And that interchange process goes back long before any of us were born, when the way connections were made were through plugs that went into an interchange, and somebody made a call from their house and they wanted to call somebody else. And actually, the first interchanges were manual. So when you look at how the cell phone industry solved these problems, you begin to realize that there's some application to tolling. Now, all of you are familiar with these things. They're all over the country. But what they tell you is that a Verizon phone doesn't really work with an AT&T phone. They don't talk to each other. What they do is they talk to an antenna and to a circuit that belongs to Verizon or to a network that Verizon is part of. And somewhere in those cell phone towers, there is a connection or an interchange back to an interchange location that actually brings those two calls together between an AT&T phone and a Verizon phone. So the use of essentially multi-protocol towers that have the ability to receive and transmit more than one different protocol was, I thought, a good example for us to be looking at. Also, in the early stages of cell phones, you would get bills. You'd get bills from a lot of different people, especially if you roamed. They very quickly got to a system of a clearinghouse that allowed all of the charges to be placed on one bill. And the more the mergers and acquisitions and these multi-protocol cell phone towers were put into place, the less and less roaming fees became an issue. And now I don't think you see roaming fees at all. My cell phone has one price I pay for national coverage, and all of that's a thing of the past. But it didn't happen overnight. It took a long time to get there as they went through all of these pains. And I thought we could short circuit some of our pains if we looked at what they did, how they did it, and followed some of their examples. One of the things was related to essentially the way cell phones started. It was a peer-to-peer network. And we had the same thing in tolling.
We did. The Northeast, the Easy Pass group, 14 states, 20-some agencies, had a peer-to-peer network for years that had been working very successfully in the Northeast.
Still does.
Still does. And so that was certainly an option for us to begin at. And from there we looked at other types of exchanges, because the Northeast had their peer exchange, but also states had a peer exchange, like Florida, Texas, California had peer exchanges within the state. The different operators would exchange data to get interoperability within that individual state.
How actually does a peer-to-peer network work? Because it sounds like a network, but at the same time, it sounds a little cumbersome.
Yeah, well, on the toll side, each agency has to come and meet with a leader that's going to facilitate the peer, typically, and they agree on business rules and communication exchange formats, and then they move transactions from one agency, sometimes only once a day overnight, to the next agency, and the next agency tries to clear those transactions to see if those customers belong to that one agency. If they do match up, then they send a response back to the agency that sent the transaction. So it's cumbersome because that just example was 2 agencies. Imagine if you have 5 of them. You have to daisy chain those all together and share information in a very timely manner to clear transactions.
And I think back in 2010, like you said, there were 14 states and about 25 agencies in Easy Pass that were doing this every day, sending transactions from one agency to the next and back and forth. And then at some period, they had to settle the money up, and they did that in a peer-to-peer arrangement too. Sounds like a lot of work.
A lot of work.
So what's the solution?
Well, we took ideas of a hub. Instead of each agency in that network connecting individually in that daisy chain to each other, let's let the agencies connect to a hub, a primary agency in that group, and then let the hubs talk together. And so that was one of the early concepts. And actually, we had some help with that. The Alliance for Toll Interoperability was a group of 20-some states, I think, that committed to interoperability. And part of their effort, aside from interoperability education, was the concept of the development of a hub that others could use and connect to. And so they were one of the early leaders in that process, along with IBTTA, the committees that you mentioned, on fostering this idea of potentially a hub to expedite the transaction data information flowing and the financial reconciliation.
So ATI, Alliance for Toll Interoperability, was a consortium. It's a kind of a loose organization of about 35 to 40 public toll agencies who were recognizing the problem, and they were looking for a simple solution. And they hooked on to this hub approach. Hub is a clearinghouse, a central clearinghouse. The credit card industry has been using it for years, so that banks could interchange these transactions and get them settled. So their idea was that this was something that if enough public agencies got behind it, they might be able to develop a national clearinghouse that at least would be able to allow agencies to exchange the transactions and settle them from outside of their areas. And it really was a good idea, but the organization didn't have, again, it was a consortium of public agencies that had no resources.
They were volunteers.
Right, they were volunteers without any resources. So the idea was great. They certainly were a key part in moving the idea forward, but the ATI hub never really became the reality that it could have been if they had had the resources and the backing of all of those agencies. The committee, however, was moving along, and the committee really took on the challenges, all of the challenges of solving every one of the problems that we talked about in the beginning. Some of the primary strategies that the committee looked at was, first of all, to identify a uniform operating requirements. Looking at these 7 protocols, it was like a spaghetti bowl. And we knew that somehow we had to reduce the number of different technologies that were being used in the US down to some kind of a manageable number. And if we could get to 1, it would be fabulous, but we thought that was a goal. And then we established a policy that those protocols, those technologies, needed to be open architecture. They needed to be allowable for anybody to produce, because if those became, if we selected proprietary technologies, we would have become hostage of some or more than one private company. And we really wanted to create a competitive environment. And to do that, you really need open architecture. And then lastly, we thought we needed to have some kind of a testing program leading to not just the evaluation, but also a goal of implementing some type of a certification program or an evaluation program that said, yeah, this piece of equipment does meet the standards and requirements, and it will work in your car. Tom was the subcommittee chair for the roadside operations subcommittee, and did an incredible job and developed a lot of the things that you're going to see on the screen.
We worked long and hard for many years, and we ultimately came up with those 7 protocols or languages that we talked about. We were able to evaluate those commercially as well as technically, and from those 7, we pared the list down to 3. So that meant 4 of those protocols were no longer in the running for national use, and those agencies over time would have to sunset those 4 protocols.
And actually what happened is, as soon as the committee did that, we started to see those 4 started to go away really fast. Right. And they're gone now.
Right. Right. And so we ended up with 3. And it was, as Marty mentioned, it was important for those 3 to be open such that anybody could build them or make them. And so the 3 we ended up on are TDM, which is the time division multiplex, and then the 2 ISO, which are international standards, 6B and 6C. And those two, the 6B and the TDM are open through license agreements, and the 6C is open commercially through the ISO standards. So we ended up with those 3 protocols, which really changed the technology game, because then other people could come in and make innovations to those 3 protocols instead of trying to solve
solutions. Let me
interrupt
you for a second, because the work that his subcommittee did was extremely challenging. If you can think about it, 2 of these 3 protocols were owned by private vendors. Nobody else could produce their products and sell them in the marketplace. And for his subcommittee to get them to agree to a licensing agreement, and a licensing agreement for free, that they wouldn't get any royalties off of those transponders, was a huge achievement. It really did make this a game changer.
It was, and in fairness to the vendors, they're all committed to the industry too, and so they all worked hard to find solutions for us as well. And so we ended up with those 3, but that wasn't good enough. We had to test those 3 rigorously to make sure that we could show to the different toll agencies that any of those 3 are good and they'll work in your toll agency. Because as I mentioned before, some agencies have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on their technology, and they didn't want to accept a different technology without making sure that it could meet the testing requirements. So we went to Congress. We testified before Congress. We asked for money to help with the testing, because again, we're all a bunch of volunteers. So we got a little bit of money to test. We were able to test those 3 protocols. We proved that they passed all the initial testing requirements, and then we developed a path forward with certification of those technologies. So now we had the technology piece under control somewhat, but that wasn't the end of the game for interoperability, was it?
No. Our problems went way beyond the technology. The institutional side of this certainly was an issue.
Right.
What we realized was very early on that trying to go to national interoperability first was probably a mistake. That we already had the basis in these 4 large areas, the Easy Pass area up in the Northeast, Florida, Texas, and California. We already had the basis for good regional interoperability. If we could build on that regional interoperability and then find some way to connect those regions, that we could evolve essentially to a national interoperability. And then it was important for us to make sure it was flexible for the agencies. And by flexibility, we meant that we shouldn't be dictating to them exactly what kind of equipment they should be using. So we tried to give them some options. One of the options was to use multi-protocol readers and multi-protocol transponders. And the multi-protocol transponder was really something that didn't exist back then. But this is where the private sector comes into play, because that's where the innovation comes from. It doesn't come from the public agencies. The willingness to go out there and develop new products and solutions really comes from the private side of business. And at least one of them, and now more than one, has come up with a multi-protocol transponder. And that meant that an agency could have a single protocol reader at the roadside, and your multi-protocol tag might work with it, or they could have a multi-protocol reader and you could have a single tag, or both, and both just expands the options. And now with 3 protocols, we were really in position to start moving towards interoperability. And then it was also the use of video. The fact that if agencies had recently invested a lot of money in roadside transponder technology, and they weren't ready to change all of that out, but most of them, virtually all of the agencies, had cameras, even for violation enforcement. Those images, as you've seen in one of our other modules, those images can easily be used as part of a transaction. And so the combination of the multi-protocol readers and the video images gave us the basis to create transactions that could be sent to some type of a clearinghouse and exchanged.
The back office subcommittee created a document that really wrote the book, the translation book, on how to share messages back and forth, what kind of business rules needed to be in there for each agency to be able to participate in sharing these transactions, to consolidate them and to process them between independent regions. And so that was key. That document lives on, and it's continued to advance over the most recent years. And then, as Marty mentioned, agencies began procuring the multi-protocol tags and readers. I like to think of these multi-protocol readers as really interpreters, because they interpret whatever language the transponder has and formats the message properly. And the private sector really came up to the plate and all delivered good technology to do that. And then we had some examples in the Southeast region to develop the first hub to exchange video transactions, where the Southeast region reached out to North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia got together and began sharing transactions as a test case to some of these early principles.
So, Tom, the model, I think the real value that came out of this was that there were models developed that on the institutional side could be followed. And those models are really the basis for what we're seeing today in terms of some of the interoperability we're going to be showing in the next few minutes. And in terms of the technology, the private sector had the capability, I think, of doing these things. They were waiting for the public agencies to say, yes, we want to do it.
This is what we want.
And here's our high-level approach. And they took the bull by the horns and they did it. So I think the committee was the impetus for that happening. And then the last two strategies that we thought were really important was that we needed to come up with some kind of a uniform symbology, something that could be placed on a roadway sign, something that could be used just like when you walk into a restaurant, you see the MasterCard sign on the door, you know your credit card is going to work there. We needed something that said your toll account is going to work here. And it needed to be on a sign, and it needed to be legible at 80 miles an hour, so that when people are driving down the road and they see an option to pay cash on the right or electronic tolling on the left, and I know I have an interoperable transponder and there's the symbol that says it's accepted here, I can take that road and not get a violation and not, foul up somebody's business rules. And then we felt we needed to have some type of discussion that would start talking about the future and how we are going to govern this, how we're going to deal with changes as they occur, changes in technology, changes in institutions and business rules. There had to be some infrastructure in place to deal with future changes and governance. And those two things were also addressed by the committee.
They were, and the committee worked really hard to develop a national symbol. Rosa Roundtree led that committee from its beginning. And the symbol was developed, many concepts were developed, tested against focus groups, and finally, through the participation of FHWA and the MUTCD, which is the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is engineering speak for, it's the federal government's way for looking at, every sign needs to have consistent parameters, so when you're driving on the road, you know what that sign means. And so in order for a symbol to be put on a sign, it has to go through this lengthy review process, and a lot of people look at it and have input, but kudos to that committee, because now there is a draft symbol that the MUTCD, I believe, is approved and will be moving forward with, and that's what you see on the slide. A nice big check mark with a road through it showing, yeah, your device works here, it's good here. So that kind of solved the symbol issue, so everybody knows what interoperability will look like. But then the governance issue still lives on. But a lot of hard work was put into the governance issue, because as these agencies come together through hubs or whatever their network is, they need rules and business rules about, does it cost money to do this exchange between the agencies? How do we make sure the customer is taken care of through this process? And what's the financial and organizational model for this interoperability team? And that's still maturing as we move into the hub deployment of interoperability.
Basically, the conversation was really good about governance, but we realized that we're still in the infancy of this interoperability approach, and that We probably are going to have to come up with these kind of rules later once we start to mature and regions start to really link with each other. In terms of hub operations, to give you some idea of how a hub operates, a hub is really a central clearing house. And this is what a hub looks like. It's a central location where agencies who manage accounts and have roadway transactions can send their account information and their transactions into the central hub. And it's a really simple process. It's a four-step process. Each one of the members sends their valid account lists into the hub. And on a daily basis, they say these people have money in their account and they are eligible for interoperable transactions that come from someplace else. Once the hub has those account lists, the other members then basically send them their unmatched transactions. So if you remember when we walked through our process of how agencies go through a waterfall, somewhere along the line they have a transaction that they can't match up with any account. They would send that transaction to the clearinghouse. And the clearinghouse then takes that transaction and attempts to match up either the transponder ID or the license plate number against one of the accounts that's come in from the other agencies. It's really a simple process. It's a database matching process. And once those transactions are matched, the information goes back to the agencies, set of reports to tell them what's been matched, who owes what to who, and then the matches become the basis for the guaranteed payments. And that's part of the business rules of a hub, is that everybody abides, says that they're going to abide by these rules. And under these rules, these become guaranteed payments for the transactions. Nobody's going to want to do this if somebody can walk away and say, well, I'm not going to pay that one. So if the transaction meets the rules of the hub, then the agency guarantees to pay the transaction.
And so there's different types of entities in this hub. A couple that I want to mention here are the client, we call client toll agencies. These are agencies that generate transactions, but they don't necessarily have an ePass or a SunPass brand account. And so they submit those transactions into the hub to be processed and cleared and the money sent back.
In Florida, a good example would be Tampa and Miami. Those expressway authorities do not manage accounts. So all of the transactions on their road come into SunPass for clearance. In Texas, the regional mobility authorities don't sell transponders, they don't manage accounts, but they send their transactions. Most of them, I think, go to TxDOT, but some may go to NTTA or to Harris County.
And so those are examples in the blue box on the slide of the toll agency with transactions only, or a client. The other type is the payment providers, and these are sometimes private or fleet managers that have accounts and customers but don't operate toll roads. So there are private entities out there that offer transponders to long distance truckers or individuals who want interoperability. You set up an account with them, and when you show up at a local agency, those accounts are seen at the local agency, but they're passed up into the hub through these fleet managers, and those are seen in the red boxes on the slide.
So some of these fleet managers that exist today, they have individual business relationships with every one of the public agencies, and that means they're sending transactions and money back and forth, actually money back and forth, they get a transaction notice, back and forth from, it could be 100 agencies, whereas if they're hooked into a hub, it's one pipe, it's one stream of information back and forth. So you can see the efficiency that a hub brings to this process.
And finally, the connectivity on this, other connectivity on this graphic is the linking in of other hubs into hubs. So we have hub-to-hub relationships, and that's what the black circle in the upper right-hand corner is. Another hub that has a similar set of spokes and spokes with the individual nodes on it of what we just mentioned. Private agencies or agencies that just collect the tolls and send the transactions. So there's linking these different wheels of hubs together is the concept.
Once the transactions are processed and matched, we talked about the financial settlement. This is basically what a settlement report looks like. It's really a set of two reports. There's an accounts receivable report and accounts payable, AR and AP. And those reports will come back to an agency and they'll define, here's all the transactions that occurred on this date that came from all the other agencies, and those agencies will be identified. The amounts of money that those agencies owe you will be on that report. And then you'll get a second report that tells you just the opposite. Here are all the transactions that have been presented by your customers who drove on somebody else's agent's roadway.
Mm-hmm.
And now you owe those agencies, and that's basically how you settle up. But it's so much easier to settle up at one location than it is going through this process for 25 or 40 or, God forbid, 100.
It's a good thing the customer doesn't have to do that,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. It's a good thing.
Or we wouldn't be in the business.
So what is regional
Well, I think this is
interoperability
a kind of a
look like?
picture of interoperability today. So imagine 4 years ago, the only interoperability really was in the IAG group or in the individual states. And so now this slide kind of shows a glimpse of kind of where we're at with interoperability. The hub in the southeast, which is maintained by the SunPass Florida Turnpike, they're a hub for the southeast states of North Carolina and Georgia. And additionally in Florida, another agency, CFX, has reached out and become connected to the IAG group. So a CFX customer can make passage back and forth to the IAG. The IAG customers can drive on the local roads in Orlando and become and just be an Easy Pass customer. That's groundbreaking right there. But the hub that Florida's created is also going to connect to Texas. And Texas has their hub in place. It started years ago internally in Texas, but now that it's outside of Texas and it's connected to Kansas and Oklahoma, and Colorado will be added later this year. So that's the central US hub. And then beyond that, we've got the Western hub where all of California is connected, and now they're working with Washington and Oregon to connect those agencies in a West Coast ring as well as Utah.
Oregon doesn't have tolling
Not
yet,
It's on
but they are
potentially on the
talking
map.
about it because, again, around the U.S., most states do not generate enough money to even pay for the maintenance of their existing state roads. So tolling has become a major solution, especially in urban areas.
So we've come a long ways in 3 years where we only had the IAG group, which was doing a huge job in the Northeast for interoperability, and then states. And now the states are connecting to other states. And then these hubs will connect to each other shortly.
So what's going on up north, we've mentioned a couple of times that the Easy Pass group is still, at this date, a peer-to-peer network. And I think there are 17 states with 40 agencies that are exchanging and settling their transactions in a peer-to-peer manner. But Easy Pass is now looking at developing their own centralized regional hub. And once that hub is in place, there's a possibility that we'll start to see the hubs interconnect. And this is how we envisioned a long time ago that we could achieve national interoperability fairly quickly. That if there were at least regional hubs in all 4 of the major regions, and they were connected in some fashion with a serial, parallel, some type of connection, then the information can pass from one side of the country to the other. And basically using telecom networks and the internet protocols, this is a virtual instantaneous process these days. This is not something that takes days or weeks, which is the way a peer-to-peer
For a
network
transaction to clear, right.
often works.
Right.
And then, of course, there's another opportunity, and that opportunity would be some type of a central clearinghouse, a hub of hubs, if you will. And this is a possibility as well. Or maybe one of the regional hubs becomes a national hub. The flexibility is there. I think we've gotten the ball rolling in a big way. And customers, especially on the East Coast of the United States, customers can literally drive along the east coast of the United States unless you come from South Carolina or Georgia or just from a few SunPass agencies. You can almost drive anywhere with one account. And that's the basis. The technology is important, but it's really the account. You want to be able to do this just like your cell phone. Have one account that works everywhere, and I think we're almost there.
It should be easy for the customer. They shouldn't have to do anything special to be part of this, so yeah.
Yeah. During this section on interoperability, we've talked about the committee, how the committee was formed, what some of its goals and objectives were. We talked about some of the challenges that we had, both the technical and the institutional challenges. And we talked about where we are today with the hub-style interoperability and the fact that we are very close to meeting that goal of national interoperability. I'm Marty.
And I'm Tom.
And hopefully you enjoyed this, you found it informative, and hopefully you'll take a look at some of our other segments. This program is made possible through funding provided by Aegis Projects, Inc., and with the additional cooperation of Atkins, Valencia College in Orlando, Florida, and Patterson-Bach Communications.